I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to this webinar, Shaping the Future of Brain Health. This is an Emory Healthy Brain Study virtual participant engagement event. The purpose of this event is to give you an opportunity to engage with our study team and to provide you with updates about the Emory Healthy Brain Study and our Alzheimer's disease research efforts. I will be your host today. My name is Kelsey Tucker, and I joined the Department of Neurology at Emory a little over 5 years ago. And now I'm a clinical research coordinator 3 and co-team lead of the Emory Healthy Brain Study. Today, you will hear presentations from 3 speakers, followed by a short Q&A session. Throughout this presentation, please feel free to submit any questions using the Q&A function within Zoom. You can find this at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll do our best to answer these questions, but because we have a limited amount of time, we will do our best and finish most at the end. Our first speaker today will be Dr. James Law. Dr. Law is a cognitive neurologist and associate professor. In his clinical work, Dr. Law has developed a multidisciplinary team devoted to providing the best possible care and support for patients and families with Alzheimer's and related diseases. His current research is focused on improving our understanding of the early evolution of Alzheimer's disease in its silent asymptomatic stages and advancing efforts to prevent clinical disease. He serves as clinical core leader and associate director of the Emory Goizueta Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, director of the Cognitive Neurology Program, director of the statewide Georgia Memory Net, and the principal investigator of the Emory Healthy Brain Study. He will be sharing some updates with you and providing some insight into the future of the Emory Healthy Brain Study.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides here. So are you seeing my PowerPoint, I hope?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And this is, I think some of you know, this is a rerun of sorts for our event that we did in person at the Hellenic Center in December. But the folks that we had hired to record the event failed to record the event, so we weren't able to share it with others who weren't able to attend the event. So we thought, well, we'll just go ahead and do this again and allow people who weren't able to attend in person to do this, and then also be able to share it more broadly. So what I'm going to do is I want to, first of all, give some recognition and thanks to the large team of staff and other coordinators that make this study possible. So many of you will recognize many of these individuals, but it's a big team. And I want to give a special shout out to Kate Sanders, who has been the lead for this program for many years now. She started as a clinical research coordinator, and she's now overseeing the administration of the project. And Najee Samama is managing the day-to-day operations of the Healthy Brain Study. And a special shout out to Kelsey, who organized the in-person event and, of course, is serving as the master of ceremonies for today. So special thanks to all of our staff. And of course, we also have a very talented group of faculty members that are part of this work. And you're going to hear from Professor Jalayne Arias and Dr. Marla Gearing after me today, covering some topics that I know are going to be of great interest to many of you. So I want to just get us all on the same page to start by kind of reiterating what we've really come to understand about Alzheimer's disease in recent decades, and that is that it's a chronic condition, no different from other chronic conditions. So nobody wakes up one day going from a whistle clean coronary artery to an occluded artery that causes a heart attack. That happens over a period of many years and decades. And we know that the same is true for Alzheimer's disease. That in people who do develop symptoms of Alzheimer's disease with cognitive decline and progressive functional limitations, we believe now that the pathologies of Alzheimer's disease are evolving silently for 15 to 20 years before somebody ever develops symptoms. And not only that, as I'm going to allude to later, people may have this pathology and never develop disease. And so the whole purpose of the Emory Healthy Brain Study is to really study this 20-year period before any disease starts so that we can understand how that evolves and how importantly to delay and prevent Alzheimer's disease. And you've all been asked to participate by donating spinal fluid. And I think some of you know that this guy whose butt you can see right there is my butt. I'm also a participant in the study, and we've asked everybody to donate spinal fluid. And that's because the spinal fluid is in intimate contact with the brain. And so we can measure things in that spinal fluid that we can't measure reliably in other fluids. And we've known for a number of years now that the hallmark pathologies of Alzheimer's disease, these amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, are associated with these peptides, these proteins that we can measure. And in people who are cognitively, who are healthy and who don't have any evidence of pathology, the levels of their amyloid protein in the spinal fluid tends to be high and levels of the tau protein tends to be low. Whereas in patients that I see in clinic who have symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, I can determine for sure that it's being caused by Alzheimer's disease because when I measure these proteins in their spinal fluid, the levels of the amyloid protein tends to be low and the levels of the tau protein tends to be high. And so these measurements have been in use for a long time now. And more recently, there are imaging tools that we can use also to detect the presence of Alzheimer's pathology. So this is a picture. We make fun of our nuclear medicine colleagues because their pictures are all fuzzy. They're not nice and clean like MRI scans because what they're detecting is radioactive tracers that are being detected for the radioactive decay. And what you're looking at here is a positron emission tomography scan of an amyloid PET scan. And this person does not have any Alzheimer's amyloid pathology. This dark material here is all nonspecific staining. But in somebody who does have Alzheimer's amyloid pathology, these PET scans extend out, the signal extends out all the way out to the surface of the brain. So that's what a positive PET scan looks like. And one of the major advances that's happened in the last year and a half has been the availability of two drugs that have now been approved by the FDA for use in treating patients who have early stage symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And in those individuals, we can use these drugs, a drug called lecanemab or Leqembi and a drug called donanemab or Kisunla. And what those drugs do is they actually eliminate this amyloid pathology out of the brain. So this is a PET scan, an amyloid PET scan from one of my patients from 2021. And this is what her brain looked like after she'd been treated with these anti-amyloid treatments. And essentially, most of the amyloid has literally been cleared out of the brain. More importantly, what's been shown with both of these drugs, lecanemab and donanemab, is compared to people who are treated with placebo, which is shown in the blue line here and the greenish line here. People who are on active treatment with these drugs showed significantly slower decline by 25 to 30%. Now, these drugs did not stop progression. They didn't reverse the disease, but it slowed the progression of disease significantly. And that's the basis on which these drugs have gotten FDA approval. There's been a lot of discussion about what that means. What is the benefit of 25 to 30% slowing of cognitive decline? And especially when you consider the potential risk and costs of these drugs. And so the way that I conceive of this is the benefit that is important in these treatments is not the 25%. So these trials are done for a period of 18 months. And during the 18 months of treatment, people who are on active treatment decline 25, 30% less than people who are on placebo. So that's good, but the real benefit is stuff that we don't have data for. So we haven't done this comparison out to 3 years, 5 years, 7 years out. But the expectation is that if there is a rate of decline with Alzheimer's disease and you slow that decline, then over time there will be an increased cumulative benefit as you slow the progression so that the separation between untreated and treated individuals gets broader. So that's important. Why? Because when we worry about Alzheimer's disease or any other cause of cognitive decline and dementia, we're not that scared of very early stage symptoms when there might be some annoying, declines in memory and things like that. But many patients who have significant decline but are still in very early stages are still functioning completely independently and maybe winding down businesses or law practices or medical practices. The problem is that with these degenerative conditions, over time, you get to a stage where there's much more profound limitation and loss of quality of life. And this is why Alzheimer's disease and other dementing illnesses are so terrifying. So the importance of these disease-modifying therapies is most of our patients with Alzheimer's disease develop symptoms in their 70s and 80s. And so if we can significantly slow the progression of disease, what that means is we give them a much better chance of dying of whatever they're going to die of before they ever reach those really terrible, terrifying late stages of disease. And this is what I expect the real benefit and the payoff of these new treatments to be. That's not enough. What we want to do ultimately is, and we are working on getting to a point where we can initiate treatments before people get sick so that we can start to think about delaying and then ultimately preventing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease altogether. And that's where we're headed, but we're not quite there yet. Now, something else that many of you may have heard about in the last year is this explosive growth in the development of blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. And this is an area that's been evolving more rapidly than almost any other area I've seen in the 20 plus years that I've been in this field. And the thing that's really emerging from all of this is there's a blood test for something called p-tau217, which is a modified version of the tau protein. And in patients who have Alzheimer's disease, the level of this protein in the blood and the plasma is 4 to 6 times higher than in healthy individuals. There's a lot of these tests that are out there currently. And Professor Arias actually published a kind of a warning paper about some of these tests are being marketed directly to consumers because some of these tests are not well validated. But the improvements in these tests is very rapid, and I think that in the next year or two, as the controls on which tests are used get better, that we may ultimately be able to replace the spinal fluid and PET scans with these blood tests to establish very accurate diagnoses of Alzheimer's disease. So let me switch gears now and talk about what we've been doing in the Emory Healthy Brain Study and what kind of progress we've made. So this is the slide from December. So we now have over 2,300 individuals who've completed at least one visit. We've completed over 4,500 total visits. And there are now almost 800 of you who have completed 2 visits, and I think 400 or thereabouts who've completed 3 visits. And this is really important because ultimately the things that we need to learn from your participation is what happens longitudinally over time. And so right now, of all of our baseline participants who were eligible for their second visit, we've only captured about 64% of you, which is not nearly as good as what I'd like to see. But there were a lot of things, including COVID and other things that sort of interfered over the course of this work. And so if we look at any follow-up visit, so even if you'd missed your V2, if we captured you at your 3rd visit or 4th visit or even your 5th visit, and now we see that the total number of individuals for whom we have longitudinal data is about almost 75%. So not quite the 80% retention that I was hoping for, but certainly better than 63%. So we're going to continue to focus heavily on keeping you engaged in this study. The other major area of focus for us from the beginning of this study has been to work on maintaining a good diversity of enrollment in the study. And the reason for that is we know that the risk of dementia is higher in a minority population, specifically among African Americans and Hispanics. This is a study that was published a number of years ago from Kaiser Permanente of Northern California. And I did not pick this study because the lowest rates were seen in Asian Americans, but they were. But compared to Asian Americans, the risk of developing dementia over this follow-up period among self-identified Black or African Americans was 73% higher. And other studies have replicated this. So in the Washington Heights Columbia Aging Project, the risk of incident dementia, Alzheimer's disease, developing in initially healthy, cognitively unimpaired individuals increases with age, but is almost twice as high among Caribbean Hispanics and African Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites. So this is Alzheimer's and dementia is a major problem for all of us, for everybody, but it's a particularly severe problem among minority populations, and specifically among minority populations that tend to be underrepresented in research. So here's a great way to illustrate just how severe that disparity is. So these are data from the large phase 3 trial that established the benefit of lecanemab, the first drug that was approved. There were over 1,700 participants in this study, and the comparison of drug and placebo showed clear benefit of the drug. But when you look at the breakdown by race, and look at how many self-identified Black African American individuals were in this study, it was a grand total of 44 out of over 1,700 individuals. And so what that means is we have no idea if this drug is beneficial in Black African American individuals because there weren't enough individuals in the study to draw that conclusion. This whisker plot means that by going all the way over here, there is no statistically significant difference between the people who had placebo and people who had active drug. And that's just because the numbers were so small. And the same thing applied to the donanemab trial. So again, over 1,700 participants, a grand total of 40 Black African American individuals. So huge disparities in the clinical trial data, but also huge disparities in terms of our biomarker data. So most of what we know about spinal fluid and blood and PET biomarkers, imaging biomarkers in this country comes from something called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, which started in 2003. And over those various iterations of this trial, this study, 92% of participants were white and 4% were African American. Another major source of information about spinal fluid data comes from Northern European, especially Scandinavian countries, including a number of studies out of Sweden. And if anything, I suspect that that population is even whiter than the ADNI population. So really, we don't have good data on biomarkers or treatment responses in non-white populations. And so because of our long-term engagement in Atlanta with the African American community, we've actually accumulated a large number of samples from diverse volunteers, including almost 500 spinal fluid samples from African American individuals. Now, when you look at these plots, and just these are plots comparing non-Hispanic white and African American individuals among cognitively normal or CN, or patients who have Alzheimer's disease. And we've known from smaller studies that among patients with Alzheimer's disease, the level of the tau protein and a modified version, something called the p-tau or phospho-tau protein, is about 25% lower in Black patients with Alzheimer's disease compared to white patients with Alzheimer's disease. Now that we had a large number of samples from cognitively unimpaired healthy controls, we know that the same thing applies. Their levels are lower because these are all healthy individuals, but the levels among healthy controls who are African American are about 25% lower than what it is among non-Hispanic whites. The difference in A beta levels among Black and white individuals among patients with Alzheimer's disease is pretty minimal. But what was surprising is that when we look at healthy individuals, cognitively normal African Americans, their levels of the A beta protein is about 20% lower than among the healthy, cognitively unimpaired white individuals. And remember, for A beta, lower levels of A beta is bad, is associated with Alzheimer's disease, whereas higher levels of tau is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So very complex differences in these biomarkers, just dependent on self-identified race. So what is the impact of using data that's largely derived from one group of individuals and applying that to all groups of individuals? We really don't know. This is an area there's a real lack of knowledge that we need to improve. And so we've been working on that. Between 2017 and 2020, our enrollment in the Healthy Brain Study was almost 85% white participants. Since 2021, we've done much better. So since 2021, almost 35% have been from underrepresented groups. And when you combine all of them, currently we're at about 76% non-Hispanic whites and about 24% underrepresented minority populations. And we're aiming to try and get that up to 33%. So that's our goal, so that we can contribute data from this study that will be applicable, equally applicable to all individuals. Now, in addition to the spinal fluid and MRI and blood draws, you guys all do the cognitive testing, and every time I do my cognitive testing, I'm afraid that the coordinators are going behind my back and talking about how few of those 15 words La was able to memorize. Something we're going to be introducing this year is something called a VisMet, which is a visual memory test that is done very differently. This was developed by a former MD PhD student here, and then really led by Alan Levy, CC Manzanares, and then Rafi and Casey Vickers are continuing to develop this. But what we're doing here now is we're just having people look at pictures. And we've picked some pretty nice pictures, and just have you look at those pictures for a little bit, and then reintroduce those pictures with a change a couple of minutes later. And then what we're doing is we're just seeing where your eye is tracking. And normally, when people notice that something has changed, they will spend more time looking at those areas where there's been a modification of the picture. And so when you are reintroduced to this picture, people who remember, I think there was something over here that's changed, that you will naturally spend more time looking in that area. And by just tracking eye movements, we've shown that with this VisMet test, we can clearly separate individuals who are having memory problems from those who are not having memory problems. And so we're introducing this as an additional test of memory. And who knows, maybe we can eventually replace those really onerous, memorize these 15 words, remember this funky picture with things dangling off of it, and draw it from memory, and maybe be able to replace that with a much more pleasant, less burdensome task. Now, the two talks that you're going to hear after me address two very specific issues. Some of you have heard me talk about the fact that we want to be able to disclose information about biomarkers, like from your spinal fluid, if you want to know about it. This is a tricky issue for a number of reasons that Jalayne is going to tell you about. But here's one of the fundamental problems. So if we look in the brain banks of all the Alzheimer's disease research centers around the country, and we look at people who had dementia when they died and donated their brains, about 80% of those people have Alzheimer's pathology. The tricky part is when you look at the brains of individuals who are cognitively normal, who never had any problems during life, and they donate their brains, and we look after they died, about a third of them have abundant evidence of Alzheimer's pathology, but they never developed any symptoms. And so the tricky part about disclosing these biomarker results is we have to be sure that people understand what it does and does not mean. And one of the things that it does not mean is if you're healthy and you have a positive biomarker, does not mean that you're ever going to develop Alzheimer's disease. And currently, it's not actionable. There's not anything we can do about it. So when things change, and when we know that we can take people who are positive for these biomarkers and we can delay or prevent disease, That will be completely changed. We want everybody to be screened and tested because there's something we can do about it. But right now, there's not anything that you can do about it. And so it's a very open question whether people are going to want to know the status or not. And then the talk that you're going to hear from Marla Gearing is about brain donation. And when we look, we have almost 5,000 brains in the brain banks around the country in the Alzheimer's disease research centers, almost 5,000 brains from demented individuals. But among healthy individuals, we have fewer than 600 total brains from healthy donors. And so if we want to understand healthy aging versus non-healthy disease-associated aging, we need more healthy brains. And so, one of the tricky parts in Georgia is you can't consent to donate your brain until after you're dead, which is a pretty good trick. And Dr. Gearing's going to explain that to you. But our request to you is going to be increasingly bringing this to your attention and asking, when you're done with your brain, if you don't mind, could we have it? And working on a very active brain donation program from healthy individuals, which can make a major impact on research resources. So we've come a long way, in the field and in the healthy brain study, but there are a lot of things that we still haven't been able to do. So the goal of this project is to develop tools that will allow us to predict both if and when somebody is going to develop symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And we also want to improve our understanding of these markers in the disease process in minority populations so that the things that we learn from this study can benefit all people. So that's it for me. I don't know if I ran a little bit long, but hopefully not more than a couple of minutes. And I will stop my sharing and hand it back over to Kelsey and then to Professor Arias. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Law. So as a reminder, please submit any questions that you may have using the Zoom Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window. Next, we will be hearing from Professor Jalayne Arias. Professor Arias is an associate professor in health policy and behavioral sciences in the School of Public Health at Georgia State University. Her research focuses on the policy, legal, and ethical questions that arise in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, aging, and neurosciences. Her prior and ongoing studies have identified employment and insurance discrimination based on emerging techniques to identify risk for Alzheimer's disease, evaluated genetic data sharing guidelines and research, examined challenges to financing long-term care, and characterized financial and legal decision-making in young onset dementias. Her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, including the Alzheimer's Association, the Marcus Family Foundation, the Hellman Family Foundation, and the Aging Research and Criminal Health Network. Today, she will be discussing the return of research results and how these results may affect study participants.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and really pleased to be able to offer this virtually, as well as the in-person event that I was able to attend in December. And it's just such a pleasure to get to both work with Emory, which is just down the street from Georgia State University, and also get a chance to meet and hear your questions with the work. No disclosures. I do like to say my background is in law, ethics, and policy, but I am not a practicing attorney. So while I do have a law degree, I did pass the Arizona State Bar. I am no longer practicing as an attorney, and so you should not perceive anything I say as legal advice. I would strongly recommend that should you have questions that emerge that are personal legal questions or financial questions, that you seek out a lawyer or a financial advisor to explore those, because every individual situation is unique. So, one of the things that I like to remind participants and that I like to remind research teams is that you are more than a research participant, right? So you guys, looking at all of you who have enrolled in this study, it's actually quite incredible to see the resource that you've helped develop and create that supports the type of research that Dr. Law just presented. But you ultimately participate in the study, and then you go out into the real world, and you may or may not take these results with you. And the question that you'll have to ask yourself is, A, do I want these results? And also, what am I going to do with the results once I have them? And there's some context here that's important to think about in a larger scale, and what our work and the reason why this work that I've been doing is so important. So first of all, historically we would think about those who develop Alzheimer's disease and those who are currently employed as two separate populations, right? Typically, people used to retire before the age of 65, and the typical onset of dementia is around 65. And so those things never crossed. However, what we're seeing now is that more Americans are working past the age of 65 for a lot of different reasons, both for financial as well as just continued enjoyment of their position, right? People just aren't simply ready to retire at 55 or 60 or 65 in the same way that they used to. And so now we're seeing this confluence of people who are continuing to work and are now falling into the age group of those who may be at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And so that's one aspect of how we might think about where our results that we learn through a study like the Healthy Brain Study might impact us. The other place is that in this age group, people are still continuing to plan. We know that Gen Zs, those who are, the young adults who are, in their late 20s, early 30s at this stage are, only about 36% of them have life insurance. And then that increases by each different decade. But still, what you see is even baby boomers who are in the 60 to 78 range, only 57% of people have a life insurance policy as of right now. Those numbers are significantly lower in individuals over the age of 50 who have long-term care insurance. And so what this tells us is that as you're learning your research results through this study or through clinical care, you're continuing to engage in employment. You're continuing to engage in planning for your future, whether it's through what type of life insurance you might obtain or what kind of long-term care insurance you might obtain. And so as you learn this information through the Healthy Brain Study or other research, there's some questions that you might be asking yourselves or ways in which you might be using this information. You might be asking, how could I use this information to think about career planning and retirement decisions, or how could this affect my employment? How should it play into planning for long-term care services and other supports? And what are some other future financial needs that I might want to engage in? This may then, for many of you, trigger a few questions. So one of the first questions you might think is, are there risks associated with this information? So I'm going to share a little bit of research that I've done as part of, or myself and my team have done. Thank you, Dr. Law, for highlighting the paper on direct consumer testing. But really what we've heard throughout our research is we've tried to understand, how does something like a biomarker result affect long-term care or insurance or employment? And early on in 2013, 2014, right when biomarkers were starting to become a thing, that we were only testing them in CSF at that time, it was starting to emerge into amyloid imaging. We did a study where we spoke to clinicians and we asked clinicians what their concerns would be regarding disclosing biomarker results to 3 hypothetical patients. And we had some different scenarios that they would respond to. And one of our participants said that the downside would be if this information got into the wrong hands and it was used to do her harm in terms of employment or insurability. There are certainly laws in place to prevent this from happening. So this is actually, this one last quote right here, that certainly there are laws in place to prevent this, has led to a series of research studies that I've tried to explore to really understand what are the legal protections here. And it's harder to get to than you would think. So there's 2 different kinds of categories of research protections. There's those that protect your information, either privacy protections, which protect your information as far as who is allowed to access your information. And then there's confidentiality protections there that protect your information from being disclosed to others. So you can think of privacy as who's getting into your information. And then you can think of confidentiality of what are we doing to make sure that others don't have access to it, right? That we're not posting this somewhere live. And then the other category of laws that I like to think about are anti-discrimination laws. These are laws that say, if a third party, like an employer, were to access my health or research information, what kinds of legal protections would prevent them from using it against me? So in the context of genetic information, Leslie Wolf and others at Georgia State have really started to think about, how do the main federal laws apply here and how do they overlap? So the common rule, don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of that law, but the common rule applies to federally funded research. It establishes the rules and protections that we must have when we engage in research with human subjects. HIPAA is the privacy law that you all sign and know about. We all sign those HIPAA forms when we show up to an appointment. And then the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is the anti-discrimination law that focuses on genetic information, and that would include genetic information gathered through research. So I want to highlight sort of what genetic results might look like and how those are protected as a way to distinguish the other types of biomarker discrimination risks that we might see. So in the context of genetics result, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act protects against employers asking for your information. So that's a privacy protection. Similarly, just to separate out, that can be contrasted from HIPAA, which restricts who has access to your personal health information and how it can be distributed or shared with others. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act also has an anti-discrimination clause, which not only protects and prevents employers from accessing that information, it also prohibits employers and health insurers from using that information. It's also of note that as of 2010, the Affordable Care Act prohibits health insurers from using pre-existing conditions. So really, the genetic information is kind of covered by both, but you can think of the ACA as covering your clinical information and preventing that from affecting any access to health insurance. And then GINA says specifically your genetic information cannot be used in the context of health insurers. But it's important to understand that this Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which provides these really helpful protections for individuals related to their genetic information, so this would be your APOE status or other genetic information you might learn through a research study, has some limitations. So just want to hit the high points of what it does do, and then I'll talk about some of the limitations of what it does not do. So it really was aimed at making sure that we could advance genetic research and the use of genetic testing within clinical settings. And genetic information is defined to include information from genetic tests as well as your family history. So when you go into a physician's office or you go in and for a study visit and you say, you know, my mom had Alzheimer's disease or my dad had Alzheimer's disease, that statement of family history is also technically protected. And then there's two categories or two titles under the genetic law. One prohibits discrimination based off of genetic information in health insurance, and then the other applies to employment. However, there are some caveats to be aware of. So first of all, this law does not provide protections in the context of long-term care or life insurance or disability insurance, right? And these are the three insurance that we think about accessing or obtaining as we start to plan for our future as we age. And those three categories of insurances are not protected underneath this law at this time. Additionally, there's a carve out under GINA that only applies to employers with more than 15 employees. So as a result of that, there are, this only actually covers 15% of employers and 17 million people, right? Because a lot of us are working for large employers, but for all of the smaller employers with less than 15, GINA doesn't actually provide protections in that context. Additionally, GINA ceases to apply at disease manifestation, which is like not been very well defined. I think the writers of this law thought that meant like once you become symptomatic, you would fall underneath these other types of protections that we have. This predated ACA, but you could think about it in the context of GINA protects you when you are asymptomatic and you know your APOE status, but once you start to develop dementia like symptoms, that's when the ACA would pick up protections there. And so there was this idea that there was no gap there. But what it doesn't tell us is what about that in-between stage where maybe you're not symptomatic, but your brain starts to show pathology. There's a gap of protections there. Additionally, employers may still get access to genetic information through either inadvertent disclosures. So this is when you come into the office and you say, I just got my 23andMe status back, or wellness programs are another loophole. And then finally, there are some very specific carve-outs that I just think are really interesting around genetic monitoring of the toxic effect of materials in the workplace. And so there's like a special like category to say that if employers have a reason for monitoring your genetic information in order to examine how something like working with toxic materials could affect you, they can access your genetic information in that context. So it turns out that the types of protections that you might be able to obtain or have from discrimination really differ depending on the type of result that you have. So we saw, I went in depth about genetic information because that's the area that we know the best about, most about, and have the best detail on. But where we're still very uncertain is how would we identify anti-discrimination protections for somebody who is biomarker positive but not yet experiencing symptoms. And this is really the field that we're trying to develop out now. I always joke, like, there's one of me and now I've got this little team and we're trying to chug through it as quickly as possible to understand where the gaps are. And that's been a primary focus of our work. One place we know it does not, one really sort of like high risk area is around long-term care insurance. And so in 2018, we published an article that tried to understand how different states both adopted the NAIC, National Association of Insurance Commissions Model Act around long-term care insurance protections. And additionally, what were the provisions under that law that might apply to somebody who was at risk of Alzheimer's disease based off of biomarker status? And what we found is that nearly all states, and I would assume that Georgia is probably in that 43 that you see there, actually allows long-term care insurers to not only access your health information and use it during the underwriting privilege, but during the underwriting portion of your application. So this is when they're looking to see whether or not you would be a good insuree or not. They actually encourage insurers to do that. And so as a result of that, if you're applying for long-term care insurance and you have these pre-existing conditions, it is highly likely that you would not be able to obtain long-term care insurance, and or you would have an incredibly high premium. So question 2, how do I manage the information once I learn it? So the first thing you're going to want to do is to talk to the study team and then also seek out resources to understand what the results truly mean. And so one of the risks of disclosing results to participants can be an either overinterpretation or misinterpretation of what a particular biomarker might mean or what a genetic status might mean. So it's really important to make sure that you ask as many questions as you need to understand what the implications of that result are for you personally. And then you're going to want to think about privacy and confidentiality. So while we have privacy and confidentiality laws that are aimed at protecting our research and health information, there are ways in which our information can be disclosed, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes by ourselves. So 3 questions. Number 1, are you required to disclose? And this is a bit of a tricky question when you learn research results, in part because that's not how a lot of the legal structure has been framed. They sort of see it as like either it's health information or it's not. And so you don't need to volunteer that information to anybody, right? You don't need to call your health insurance or your long-term care insurer if you already have one and say, by the way, I just tested positive for this. However, there is a question of if there is a form that you're completing after you learn your research results that asks, are you at risk for Alzheimer's disease based off of a preclinical biomarker? And you say no, that could potentially expose you to fraud for lying on the application. Again, this does learning it through research constitute knowing hasn't been tested, at least that we've seen in our research. And so it sort of falls into a bit of a gray zone. So where do I store this information? So I would store this information in the same way that you would keep any of your health information private. So this would be, in a locked file cabinet in your home, or, if you receive it through an online portal, that you keep it behind the locked portal, and think about the safest way for you to maintain that information. And then finally, who do you tell? This is a really personal question, and it's something that you would want to explore with particularly your direct family. So as you learn these results, I think that what we hear from participants is that they sort of worry about things like, will I be stigmatized by my friends if I disclose this information? Will they treat me different? Other family conversations may be like, you may have people in your family who don't want to know your genetic status because it might mean something to them. Similarly, there may be reasons why people do or do not want to know about your biomarker status, and there may be friends or family that you feel more comfortable having these conversations too. But I really encourage people to think about sort of that zone of privacy as it sort of builds out, and being really careful about who you talk to. Certainly, any conversations with employers or insurers should be preceded with high caution. And then also with clinicians, it's just important to understand that if this research result becomes part of your clinical results, there's a different protection there. And so once it's in the medical record, it may be more accessible to an employer or an insurer. And then, whether or not you discuss it with a financial advisor might depend on why you're having that conversation with them and whether or not it's truly relevant to the guidance you're seeking there, and your relationship with the financial advisor. Okay, so final question is, what planning or next steps should I take to prepare? So one important thing is that, before you learn your biomarker status or before you learn results, you may, if you have not already, consider how you're going to plan for long-term care services. And I would say you probably should do this even if you've already learned your results. It's not too late. But starting to understand what could be your options. We know that long-term care services and supports are extremely expensive. One important caveat to understand is that Medicare and Medicaid, well, Medicare does not currently cover long-term care services. You can qualify for Medicaid to cover long-term care services, but you have to do the spend down, and that can be incredibly difficult, particularly for individuals in the middle class. And in fact, we know that long-term care services are particularly expensive for individuals with dementia. I was a co-author on this paper led by Jalayne, where she looked at how much people were paying out of pocket for long-term care services. And we looked at it to the ratio of their personal income. And it's actually really significant for individuals who are experiencing dementia. So some things to think about is private long-term care insurance. It's not actually a great product. I know that some people do have it. Usually the people that have it, it works really well for, but it can be really difficult to obtain, particularly if you're buying it outside of the context of an employer. Typically, they've got incredibly high premiums. There's a high rate of denial. So about 24% of people are denied based off of health information alone. And there's some serious limitations on benefits. So if you do have a long-term care insurance policy, I would encourage you to go look at that policy and understand your elimination periods, the benefit triggers, and then the benefit caps. So elimination periods are how long you must wait after accessing or after obtaining the policy to be able to actually access coverage, and how long after you meet the benefit triggers can you get coverage. So a lot of times what this means is that even if you qualify from I'm experiencing these symptoms and thus I need support, there sometimes can be like a 3 to 6 month waiting period before you're able to actually get coverage, which can put people in a difficult scenario where they need services, but they don't have coverage for it at the time. And then what the benefit triggers are, these are usually based off of needs and your activities of daily living. What are you actually capable of doing? And all of the policies that I know about have pretty severe benefit caps, either at the daily or on the lifetime scale. And so what are the alternatives? So some of them include private saving, adding a life insurance runner. So a life insurance runner is a provision on your life insurance policy that allows you to access some payout on that policy should you need it for long-term care services. And very few states, Washington specifically, are starting to offer public options. However, those are still sort of under the development stage, and it's unclear yet how those will actually be implemented. And then finally, the last thing that you can do is to make sure that you're doing your advanced care planning at this stage. This is the best time to do it while you're cognitively healthy. You want to make sure that you have both a living will and a power of attorney. Your living will, make sure that your individual desires are respected about how you would or would not like to receive treatment at the end of your life. It kicks in when a physician determines that you have 6 months or left in your life. And then a power of attorney tells us who is going to be making those decisions for you. And they can come into two types, both healthcare and then durable, which would include financial decision making. Just want to say thank you to those who fund my work. And I have had the luck of working with some really fantastic emerging scholars in the field throughout my career, and just so like to acknowledge the efforts that they've been putting into the team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Arias. We're getting some great questions from attendees, so please continue using the Q&A function within Zoom to submit any questions that you may have. Our next speaker is Dr. Marla Gearing. Dr. Gearing came to Emory in 1990 after receiving a PhD at the University of Wisconsin. Her main area of interest is the neuropathology of neurodegenerative disease. She has served as the Neuropathology Core co-leader since the inception of the Emory Goizueta Alzheimer's Disease Research Center in 2005. She is also a participant in our study in the Healthy Brain Study, and today she will be sharing some answers to frequently asked questions about brain donation.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Let's see. All right. And beginning. Well, I'm telling it to do the slideshow from the beginning. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. All righty. So, as Dr. Law and Kelsey told you, I'm going to be talking about brain donation and trying to answer some frequently asked questions about brain donation. I don't have any disclosures to report. So as Dr. Law said, Emory Healthy Brain Study would like your brain when you're done using it. But why do we want your brain? So one thing is that clinical pathologic correlation, as Dr. Law alluded to, some healthy people end up having pathology, some don't. And we'd like to look at the clinical results, all the clinical data that were collected and compare those to the neuropathologic results. As he also talked about, there is a critical need for normal brains, and there are very few out there. So the Emory Healthy Brain Study is hoping to help with that need across the board. And as I mentioned previously, some cognitively normal individuals show pathology, and we also need brains representing diverse populations. We have very few brains from non-Hispanic, from other groups besides non-Hispanic whites. The vast majority are from non-Hispanic whites, and they may not be the same. Things may not always be exactly the same. So we're trying to look at diverse brains. So most of these questions that I'm going to be talking about come from our ADRC experience. The Emory Healthy Brain Study is looking at healthy people. So most of those people have not died yet. Whereas in the ADRC, we have 20 years of experience dealing with brain donation. So most of these questions come from that. So one big question we have is, what is the difference between body donation and brain donation? Well, with body donation, the entire body is donated to the Emory Body Donor Program. With brain donation, what happens is that the body is transported to Emory. The brain and spinal cord are removed by the Alzheimer's Disease Center Emory Healthy Brain Study staff, and then the body is released to the funeral home for burial or cremation. And then the next obvious question is, can I do both? And it's not, strictly speaking, impossible, but if you sign up for the body donor program, they basically have first dibs. So they have priority over the ADRC and the Emory Healthy Brain Study. And there's no guarantee that we would be able to get the brain. So generally what I tell people who ask me, can I do both, is to say that it's best to assume that the two are mutually exclusive and choose the option that is most important to you. So another question, if I check the organ donation box on my driver's license, won't that take care of brain donation? And no, it won't. With organ donation, organs are removed for the purposes of transplantation into a living person. We haven't quite gotten there with the brain yet. So no, that does not apply to the brain donation. So next question, I am a participant in the Emory Healthy Brain Studies research program. How can I sign up for brain donation? Many of you have probably received an email asking if you would be interested in signing up for brain donation. If you have not or want to get more information, you can contact Starshield at emory.edu. And that's the email address right there. So once you've indicated an interest in donating your brain, what else do you need to do? Well, as Dr. Law said, per Georgia law, you cannot consent to brain donation in advance of your death. Some states allow that, Georgia does not. So it's very, very important to make sure that your family members, especially your next of kin, know of your desire to donate your brain. You also need to make sure that any relevant individuals have the 24-hour answering service number, which is right here on the screen. You should also be getting a card with that contact information. So share that with your family members. Also, if we're younger, healthy right now, we may not be so healthy when we get older. So, if we end up in a care facility, it's also helpful to share that information with care facility staff. So what happens when your family member calls that 24-hour number? Well, the answering service, that 24-hour answering service, will contact the person on call, which we have a series of people, staff members, who serve that function. The staff person on call then contacts your family member, calls them back to gather some information and take consent for the autopsy. And all of this can be done over the phone. The staff person also arranges transport of the body to Emory for the brain and spinal cord autopsy. And then finally, when the autopsy is complete, the funeral home is notified, the funeral home of your choice is notified that the body is ready to be picked up. So what's it going to cost me or cost my family? There are no costs to study participants. The Emory Healthy Brain Study will cover the transportation of the body to Emory for brain removal, and there's no fee for the autopsy itself for Emory Healthy Brain Study participants. Of note, however, the Emory Healthy Brain Study does not pay for cremation or funeral costs. Those are the responsibility of the family. So if I donate my brain, is it going to delay the funeral? In most instances, there's no delay. The body is typically released to the funeral home within 24 hours, usually much less of arrival at Emory. I mean, obviously, if we have somebody die on Christmas morning, holidays can, put a slight delay, but typically what happens is the body is transported to Emory, the autopsy is done immediately. We have an autopsy staff on call 24 hours and the body is released. The funeral home is called literally within an hour or two of the arrival of the body at Emory. So it's usually a very quick turnaround time. Can I have an open casket? Absolutely, yes. Brain removal is performed in such a way that open casket funeral is possible, and I can speak to this from personal experience. My grandparents both donated their brains to the Alzheimer's Center way long time ago. And they were both in Salvation Army officers. And in the Salvation Army, open casket funerals are the norm. And we were able to proceed with that with absolutely no problems. So what happens to the brain after it is donated? Well, the first thing that happens is we do a very thorough neuropathologic evaluation. And we collect a lot of data for that clinical pathologic correlation that we talked about. We also provide a copy of the report to the family, typically within 6 months after death. So again, we're healthy right now. We may not be by the time we die. So if we have a neurodegenerative disease or something, the family is going to find out what the brain showed. And finally, the tissue that is collected is banked and distributed to investigators for research on various neurodegenerative diseases. And we literally send, share tissue with investigators at Emory throughout the country and literally throughout the world. So some people are concerned about how their loved one's body will be treated. And I can assure you that all deceased individuals and their brains are treated with the utmost respect by ADRC staff. We would not accept anything less than that. As I said, my grandparents donated their brains, and I could hardly ask somebody to donate, a family member's brain if I knew that the body was not going to be treated with respect. So why should I donate my brain? What is my family going to get out of it? Well, importantly, the opportunity to contribute to research. We're all doing that right now. We go for those awful cognitive tests that Dr. Law talked about. We give spinal fluid, we give blood, we give anything and everything we're asked to give. And this adds to that contribution to research. In the case of a neurodegenerative disease, as I mentioned, the family will get diagnosis, and that often provides some closure for the family. And it also gives information for the next generation. It provides some information about the family history. So more about that contribution to research. As we, alluded to, we need a lot of brains for research. We want to study normal brains versus disease brains. We want to look at different stages of the disease and progression of the disease. We want to look at different diseases. I mean, we have a host of neurodegenerative disease type brains in our brain bank. So people are studying all kinds of different diseases, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia. We also, get some brains with rare diseases, and those are exceedingly important because for people who want to study a rare disease, they literally contact brain banks around the world to get enough cases to do a meaningful study. And we've provided, brains, tissue from brains with rare diseases to some of these studies. We may only have one or two in our brain bank. So you can see they have to go to a lot of places to get enough brains to study. And finally, we want to look at different races and ethnic backgrounds and try and understand better how those factors affect pathology and disease progression. It's also the case that a single brain contributes to many different studies. So for an Alzheimer's disease or, some other disease brain, I would say the average, contribution is that maybe tissue may go to 5 different studies per year. But think about the control brains. Everybody needs control brains, normal brains, no matter what kind of disease you're studying, right? And yet we have very few. So a single normal control brain may contribute to 15 to 20 studies per year. So those are really, really important. This Emory Healthy Brain Study is very, very important. And finally, as I mentioned, my grandparents, who were Salvation Army officers, both contributed their brains to the Alzheimer's Disease Center many years ago. And part of the reason I do what I do is to honor their legacy and also that of my parents who contributed their brains more recently. And with that, I will close, and I think we are going to go to questions and answers at this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gearing. You're correct. For the last few minutes, we are going to answer a few questions from the audience. So as a reminder, feel free to submit any questions that you may have using the Q&A function within Zoom. We'd love to answer every single question that you guys have submitted, but we are limited on time, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. So our most popular question so far is actually going to be for all of you, if you would like to comment. Do you have any idea how the federal budget cuts that are being enacted by the current administration will affect this study and Alzheimer's research in general?
Well, so I anticipated that these questions might come up. The shortest answer is we don't know yet. There have been so many different announcements and changes that have been coming out of Washington. It is unclear what is going to actually be final policy, and also what may be impacted by lawsuits. And so, for the time being, we're all kind of anxious about things. People everywhere in the research enterprise are very anxious about things. But for the time being, I can tell you that we have no intention of stopping what we're doing. We've had some questions about whether we were even able to continue to see research participants. We haven't stopped, and we have no intention of stopping. And whatever challenges come, it's our intention to overcome whatever is tossed in our way, so that we continue what we think is very important work. And hopefully there'll be broad support for continued research on Alzheimer's and other important diseases.
Thank you so much. I know that's been a question that we've received recently from a lot of our participants. So our next question is going to be for Professor Arias. So this participant would love to know if they made a huge mistake by doing their Ancestry.com or 23andMe submissions.
Sure. So complicated question to answer, but so there's two components of Ancestry and 23andMe. There's the general sort of like learning about your genetic information. Do you have the cilantro gene, or learning about your ancestries, and that's one panel. 23andMe puts actually the medical information behind a like secured portal, so you have to consent for that. And I would say that if you've already done it, just being really aware of how you're handling those results and who you're disclosing those to. If you haven't done it yet, I would be very cautious. So something about 23andMe is that they are a commercial entity. They are not a healthcare provider. And so your data is not protected in the same way. And in fact, 23andMe has had some pretty recent and egregious incidents of data breaches. And so that's one component of it. Additionally, because it's commercial data, it's actually sellable and accessible by other organizations that aren't health organizations. So it just depends on how you want to think about how your data is being protected and what your potential interest is. I think if you're curious about what your APOE status is, the best option is to actually talk to your healthcare provider about learning that information about yourself, and if possible, having a conversation with a genetic counselor. I think it's also really important for people to understand that while 23andMe is providing testing, at least at this time, for APOE status, that is only one genetic marker amongst the many that researchers are looking into that relate to Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And so it's actually not like super conclusive information for health purposes.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Gearing, we got quite a few questions during your presentation. So I'm going to start off with just a few of the questions for you. So the first question is, I live out of state. How do I ensure that my brain gets to Emory?
Okay, that's a really good question. The most important thing is to do advanced planning and have, talk to the study team, get in touch with me, let us know where you are, because we can set up an arrangement with a local pathologist to have the brain removed locally and shipped to us. If you're like in Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, one of the states kind of surrounding Georgia, we may even be able to have our transport company go there, bring the body to Emory, and then return the body to your home. But it really depends. And so advanced planning is the key right there.
Perfect. Thank you. So another question for you, Dr. Gearing, is you can't donate your brain before your death, as you stated. Your next of kin has to do this. Is this the same for donating your whole body? That is, can you donate your whole body prior to your death, or does your next of kin have to do this?
Well, in terms of the legalities, I honestly don't know because I don't run the body donor program. I do know you can sign up in advance, but again, it's also dependent on the next of kin because you aren't going to be alive to call the body donor program. So somebody's got to make that phone call. And I know, the body donor program also has a screening process. So, your next of kin would call and talk to the body donor program and go through all that screening. I don't honestly know what their consent process is. But no matter what you do, your next of kin has to be informed and involved because you aren't going to be there to be making phone calls.
I just want to point out that when Kelsey said, repeated the question is, can you donate your body before you die? I was cracking up. But because you can't consent to donating your brain, you just warn your kids or whoever that you're going to haunt the crap out of them after you die if they don't follow through on your wishes.
Yeah, and I can just clarify like where this like weird loophole comes from. So in 2018, the federal government changed the common rule. And in that change, they determined that doing research on an individual after they died is no longer human subjects research. And so as a result of that, it's your family providing authorization afterwards, which is this like really weird loophole to say like, when we do research on people after they've died, it's not technically considered human subjects research, but a lot of researchers operate with the same level of respect as they would if an individual, right? So this is what Dr. Gearing is talking to us about, as if the individual is a continued human. And so it's just this very weird caveat that has to do with sort of property law that most people don't want to geek out over. I think my husband and I are the only ones that find this interesting, but that's where that weird loophole comes from.
Thank you. So Dr. Gearing, I just have one more question for you. It's twofold. So the first portion is after you donate your brain, will you still be able to have a funeral service? And the second question is, after you donate your brain, can you still be cremated?
Yes, honestly, you can do either. As I said, there's no real delay in any sort of funeral planning or type of funeral, open casket versus not. So you can do that. And the delay, if you are a member of a religious organization where, a service within 24 hours is important, we can usually accommodate that even. And certainly, cremation, yes, absolutely. It's really your choice, the choice of you and your family, how your body, your remains are taken care of, once you die. We take the brain out and then it goes right back to the family.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So this question I think is going to be for Dr. Law. So we've gotten this question from a few participants today. Where would you say genetic testing currently fits in predicting the risk of developing dementia?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The genetic testing. So there's something called a polygenic risk score. So you've heard us mention ApoE a couple of times, and ApoE is a very important Alzheimer's disease risk gene. But it's only one, as Jalayne mentioned, it's only one of now dozens of different genetic contributors to Alzheimer's disease. And so the polygenic risk scores, using every single known genetic variant that impacts Alzheimer's disease risk, can be helpful, but is not terribly predictive. So at best, its ability to predict whether somebody's going to develop Alzheimer's disease or not is somewhere around 80%, is the best possible performance that you see. And so it's really and the reason for that is there are major genetic contributors to Alzheimer's disease, but remember this always occurs in the context of other things, and most importantly, aging. So when I joke around that if you want to avoid Alzheimer's disease, just do two things: be highly selective in your choice of parents and don't get old. Both of those are major contributors. And so the genetic risks are, I think, an important aspect of this. As we go towards trying to predict, we haven't really figured out all the things that we're going to have to factor in, but we're actively thinking about how to analyze longitudinal data. And I think that genetics and genetic composition, the risk factor genes, will probably play a role in that. But it's still a complicated research area that needs a lot of additional work.
Quick follow-up question. So how close would you say blood tests are to coming into play in replacing the lumbar puncture and indicating Alzheimer's risk or dementia? Because a lot of participants have expressed a little bit of hesitancy about the lumbar puncture. So I think that's why this question has been asked.
Yeah. So, um, so if we look in the context of clinical care, it's getting very close. So these tests are very accurate, and the best of these blood tests will give you the same information as the spinal fluid test or the amyloid PET scan if what you're looking for is to confirm or refute the possibility of Alzheimer's disease being the cause for somebody who has symptoms. The biggest, but when we're talking about this in the research context, one of the reasons that we're going to continue to collect spinal fluid is we don't have all of the tests yet. We don't know what markers to look at. And so when we look at spinal fluid, we're not just using those currently known Alzheimer's markers. We're studying the spinal fluid to try and identify other tools that will actually help us predict what's going to happen in the future, because these current tools don't do a sufficient job of accurately predict who's going to potentially get in trouble in the future. So as we discover those, the effort will be ongoing to translate those new tests or new markers from spinal fluid to blood, because ultimately we want to be able to do all of this without subjecting people to stressful or invasive procedures.
Thank you. So, Jalayne, this question is for you. You may not know the exact answer, but if a participant were to find out that they are APOE positive and they told their insurance company, would they automatically be denied coverage?
So if you already have insurance, they can't retroactively deny your use of the policy. Um, there's always like really weird carve outs. Like it's hard to know depending on your precise policy, but they can't take away your policy once you have it. There may be components of your policy that you would want to look into to understand sort of when they will or will not provide coverage.
Great, thank you. So this is a question that just came in. So are any of the markers that we study in the Emory Healthy Brain Study also important in other forms of dementia? For instance, Lewy body or Parkinson's disease dementia, et cetera?
So great question. And one of the things that I think we probably don't highlight enough is how much your participation in the Healthy Brain Study can support other research efforts not directly targeting Alzheimer's disease. So, for example, you mentioned Lewy body dementia specifically. We're part of a consortium that's looking at developing better biomarkers for Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. And so, although we don't routinely measure things like alpha-synuclein or doing something called the alpha-synuclein aggregation assay or things like that that are currently being studied in Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia, we share spinal fluid samples, for example, with investigators who are specifically looking at those biomarkers. So although it's not a focus of the Emory Healthy Brain Study, we are really collaborating with people all over the place, both locally and nationally, to support other research. And the availability of healthy spinal fluid samples from healthy individuals, just like we said about for brain donations, people don't routinely collect spinal fluid from a lot of healthy people. So, and so the ability to contribute to lots of research with the healthy materials from Healthy Brain Study is really important.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Gearing, this question may be between you and Professor Arias. So, if you decide that you want to donate your brain, do you think that this is something that you should include in your will?
I'm going to let Jalayne talk to that first.
Yeah. So definitely, I think that there are some living wills that allow you to include that language, or definitely something that you might want to add to that component. And then I would actually, not to punt the question completely, but this is the time when I would talk to like elder law attorney as you're doing your estate planning about the best place to put this. I think the biggest risk, of course, that's something that Dr. Gearing and Dr. Law have already pointed out, that the biggest block is going to be whether or not your family knows that this is your wishes, right? So it's sort of like when you're an organ donor, it's really important to like people around you know that that is something that you think is important, in the same way that you may or may not be having discussions about what kind of funeral you would like or how you would like to be treated after you die. These are the kinds of things that you want to make sure are in place, because it can take weeks sometimes before people get to a will or a living will after somebody has died. And so you may actually end up losing the opportunity to donate your brain if your family's not reading your will until a week later.
Dr. Arias just said everything I would have said and then some, so we're good.
Excellent. Well, this one is specifically for you, Dr. Gearing. So after Emory receives a person's brain, can other departments use the brain or the body if they've chosen to donate the body for research or study? How does this work? Does it get placed in a repository, etc.?
So when somebody donates their brain to, the Emory Healthy Brain Study, the Alzheimer's Disease Center, we have a tissue bank. And we bank the tissue, we do a diagnostic workup, and then we bank the tissue, and we share that with investigators at Emory. The body donor program does their own thing. They have different uses for the body, but within the context of brain donation, we have a process where, an investigator might submit a tissue request, And that goes through an approval process. And then assuming it's approved, which the vast majority of tissue requests are approved, we would fill that request and share it with the tissue with investigators at Emory or, around the country, literally around the globe. We've, sent tissue to a variety of studies.
So another question we received is, are substantial lifestyle changes considered meaningful actions towards lowering your Alzheimer's disease risk, similar to how certain lifestyle changes can alter your heart disease risk?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm glad it came up. And the answer is absolutely yes. There's something called the Lancet Commission that releases a report every few years, and there was one released last year. And what they do is they comb through the medical literature and try and estimate what the impact of different modifiable risk factors are. And so when you look at different factors that are lifestyle factors, education, obesity, controlling hypertension, hearing loss, depression, social isolation at different stages of life. Those lifestyle factors, when you add them all up, mean that up to 45% of all late life dementia may be preventable just by lifestyle interventions. And so those things are critically important for healthy aging. We think that healthy lifestyle behaviors, diet, exercise, controlling risk factors, engagement, mental stimulation, we think that can also increase your resiliency, your brain's ability to resist the effects associated with both aging and disease. And that may be one of the reasons why one person who has a lot of pathology but has no symptoms, while another person who has very similar pathology may have tons of symptoms. So lots of factors related to lifestyle. There's something called social determinants, so our entire life experiences, what our exposures were to access to health and healthy diets, exposures to air pollution, to economic stress or prejudice or other stressors, how all of those things may contribute to your likelihood of being healthy or not healthy in late life. So yeah, very important question and something that everybody should be doing.
Great advice. So this is a question also for you, Dr. Law. Why is early detection even important if there's no cure?
Because there will be. So our advice about being cautious about getting biomarkers when you're healthy, getting results of biomarkers when you're healthy, those cautions are applied today, but there are trials that are underway right now that are exploring ways that we might be able to delay or prevent Alzheimer's disease. And the day that we have evidence that having biomarker evidence of silent pathology is actionable, that I can do something about it to reduce your risk or prevent you from getting Alzheimer's disease down the road, the answer to the question of whether we should get biomarker testing, it gets flipped on its head. And then it becomes the same answer as, yes, you should get a colonoscopy. Yes, you should get a mammogram. Yes, you should get your blood tested for cholesterol and other things, because those things are actionable. And so once that happens, the answer will be very different. And early detection for symptomatic individuals right now is critically important, because the newer treatments, those drugs that I mentioned, are only beneficial to patients in very early stages of disease. So if you wait too long in the course of the disease, those drugs are no longer effective. And I expect that the same will be true as we start to develop therapies designed to delay or prevent disease.
I'd also sort of just also offer that we know that by detecting cognitive impairment either earlier in this course or even before can help people make decisions. So even though I gave a lot of caution about not learning, about the potential consequences, there's also some people who, if depending on their personal values and preferences, of course, this is not universal to everybody, see that there's value in having that information for things like, what other kinds of research studies might I be eligible for? What kind of lifestyle changes might I want to make? How might I want to plan for my future, right? And so I think it's a very personal decision about when you might want to seek out information. But I think it's also important to understand that we have seen time and time again that there's huge benefits both from monitoring lifestyle changes, et cetera, that come when we detect early.
So speaking of clinical trial drugs, Dr. Law, could you share a few words on the drug remternetug with us?
Great job pronouncing that.
Thank you.
This is a drug that's under development by Lilly, and even internally at Lilly, they just refer to this drug as Remy instead of trying to call it remternetug. And that drug is sort of son of donanemab. So donanemab or Kisunla is the drug that Lilly has gotten approval for from the FDA and that we're currently using in patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. Remternetug is a modified version of that same drug. There's two major advantages we think maybe with remternetug versus donanemab. One is kind of technical, but with these drugs, oftentimes when you use these anti-amyloid monoclonal antibodies and infuse them into the body will generate antibodies against the drug. So there's something called anti-drug antibodies. And one of the limitations for donanemab is after about a year of treatment, almost everybody develops anti-donanemab antibodies, and that may reduce the effectiveness of the drug in some people. Remternetug does not have as much of an effect in terms of provoking that sort of immune response. The second major advantage, and this is sort of across the board, right now, all of these drugs are administered by IV infusion, and Lilly and Eisai and other companies are working on formulations that can be given subcutaneously. And so remternetug is a subcutaneously administered drug, and so that's a significant advantage. And it's being evaluated in both early symptomatic Alzheimer's patients, and they're, I think, planning to launch a trial on using it as prevention, just like is happening with lecanemab and donanemab.
Thank you. So I think that this will be our final question, and it is sort of a follow-up question on what you just said, Dr. Law, but what are the costs associated with these types of medications?
Yeah, they're not cheap. Both of the current drugs are somewhere in the neighborhood of about $25,000 per year. The administration duration for the drugs is 12 to 18 months, and so they're quite expensive drugs because they've gotten standard FDA approval. Medicare is covering the costs associated with those treatments. And most insurance companies are doing so as well. The last time I encountered a problem, Cigna is the only company, a commercial insurer that I'm aware of that up until at least a couple of months ago, they were refusing coverage for any of their commercial insured patients. They're declaring these drugs as experimental and refusing coverage. Different Medicare Advantage plans may pose some barriers, but by and large, they've been allowing coverage. So they're expensive drugs, and I think there's a lot of sort of concerns about the relative benefits and also what the long-term financial impacts of these expensive drugs will be on on viability of Medicare, for instance, because if enough patients are on these drugs, the cost can be quite enormous. So we'll have to see how all of this shakes out. But as other competitors come online, hopefully the numbers go up. Hopefully the drug companies will be able to recognize sufficient profit without gouging, huge expensive costs for these drugs.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Dr. Gearing and Dr. Law and Professor Arias for answering all of these questions. I did want to note, however, that all the EHBS participants do get an email quarterly, a newsletter, and within that newsletter, there is a link for Ask Dr. Law, so you can submit some questions there if you feel like your questions haven't been answered today or if you come upon any additional questions. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us and for your continued participation in our study. We truly could not do this work without you. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Hi guys, thank you.